Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Karen Bassarab, and with me is my coworker Rachel Santo, and also in the room with us is Ann Palmer. We are the Food Policy Networks project team. We're delighted that you're joining us this afternoon for an overview about keeping track of food policy councils, an overview of the 2018 Food Policy Council Census results. This is the first time that we've done a webinar about the results of the Food Policy Council survey. And so we're going to go over a little bit of the reason why we do this survey, the history behind it, kind of how it's grown and evolved over the past 6 years, as well as dive in a little bit to the data and talk about how the information from this survey gets used. Before we do that, though, I wanted to give you a little background about Zoom, the platform that we're using this afternoon. Within Zoom, you should have the option to open a chat box as well as to open a Q&A box. If you have any comments or questions, please, we ask you to type your questions into the Q&A box and your comments into the chat box. We're always interested to hear from you during this webinar, kind of how you use the census data, questions you have about the survey, things that we don't know about councils yet that you would be interested in learning about. This survey is something that we continue to evolve and use to grow our understanding of trends with food policy councils, and so we're always looking for feedback in what other information and data we could collect. So again, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to hop into a little bit of background about this survey and about our network. If I can move the slides. The Food Policy Networks project is a project of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, which is based in the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. The project started in 2013 with the Center for a Livable Future. We're an outgrowth of a project that came from the Community Food Security Coalition. When it disbanded in 2012, Mark Winnie, who was helping to grow a network of councils, was looking for a home for that project, and it came to live with us at the Center for a Livable Future. Since that time, we've kind of been growing support, assistance, resources to help food policy councils develop kind of different strategies, grow new councils. We do this kind of through a number of ways. Most of our work is virtual. We maintain an online directory of 300 councils. We have a listserv for councils to be able to share their experiences, stories, resources, ask questions. We also maintain a resource database that has over 1,200 resources and counting related to food policy and food policy councils. All of these resources are available on our website. You can visit them at any time and download information, learn about what councils are in your state. In addition to these resources, we also host webinars, give presentations at conferences, host trainings and convenings. So a lot of our work is around kind of being a resource information hub as well as a convener for councils. One of the biggest projects that we do, have been doing on an annual basis is the Food Policy Council Census. So before we get into details about the census, I wanted to kind of start with an understanding of what we consider a food policy council. A food policy council for this project is an organized group of stakeholders from various sectors that may be sanctioned by a government body, or may exist independent of government, which works to address food systems issues and needs at the local, state or provincial, regional, or Native Americans, First Nations level through policy. And so some of the key elements that are highlighted in this slide are that it's a multi-stakeholder or multi-sector group of stakeholders, that these councils address food systems issues, and they do that in some way through policy. Food policy councils go by various names. We use the term Food Policy Council because it's the most commonly used name amongst groups. However, we noticed that they go by a myriad of different names, such as a Food Council, Food and Farm Network, an Alliance, a Food and Agriculture Coalition, Healthy Food Access Committee. And the reason for these names is what resonates within the context of the jurisdiction where councils are working. Oftentimes policy is a taboo term, and so for some councils it's better to kind of not use that term and have them be named something else that's more acceptable, more open to others joining them, and then they kind of wade into policy as they age. So they don't have to go by Food Policy Council for us to consider them a Food Policy Council and to ask them to complete our survey. In addition to kind of understanding that this is a group of stakeholders from multiple sectors, we also talk about them looking at the food system. There are a number of alliances, coalitions that work on environmental sustainability, that focus on anti-hunger, that may work on new and beginning farmer issues. These groups that we look at and track are really looking across the food system. So somewhere in their mission or their vision is some indication that really their goal and their long-term vision is set on changing our food system. And that means working across kind of the food supply chain, understanding that there are other influences on what happens with food, from transportation to housing, to issues with race and equity. So they're kind of looking a little bit broader beyond just the food supply chain, but also knowing that ultimately long-term, they want to see change in this system. And so some examples of some missions that we've seen that kind of attack or kind of look at this entire food system is from the Nebraska Food Policy Council that envisions a thriving, inclusive, and accessible local food system that strengthens our economy and environment while fostering food security for all Nebraskans through collaboration with diverse agencies, organizations, individuals, and communities in the state. And in that statement, it really captures a lot of things that food policy councils do. The approach for the food system, through the survey, we measure in a couple of different ways and are still learning about how councils address food systems. We know that through the policy work that they do, they don't work on the food system all at once. It's kind of a really big, heavy task, but somewhere there is this notion that long-term they're going to change it.
Can I just jump in and add and say that this is one of the elements that makes it most tricky to do the survey every year, because it requires some subjective decision making around whether a group is focused on a single issue or is actually looking at the broader food system, because some groups might start in one area and then realize they need to address other parts of the food system. And so we kind of sometimes struggle with how to define whether or not a group does and doesn't count based on this metric, but we try our best.
In addition to looking at the food system, we also qualify councils as doing some work on policy. And for us, policy and what we consider food policy is very broad and very open. So we're not just talking about legislative changes, changes in code or ordinance. We're talking about administrative changes. We're talking about modifications to institutional policies, things that kind of impact broader populations, have more of a long-term impact. So food policy doesn't necessarily always have to be that a group is working on state legislation or a city ordinance. And it also doesn't mean that councils start off working on food policy. We know that for councils that are younger, a lot of time it takes a couple of years to get their feet grounded, for them to develop what their policy priorities are. You're bringing groups together from different sectors that may have a different agenda, may have a different focus for their work. And so it takes time to bring those groups together to determine what are the policy priorities that a group can work on together that they couldn't do alone. And so we use this term in terms of food policy councils a little bit loosely, knowing that kind of there is this building up that has to take place or can have to take place in order for them to work on policy. And we also look at it through a number of lenses, that it can be at an institutional level, that it could be administrative. Sometimes these areas of tackling changes to bylaws for a school or for a hospital might be easier than changing legislation. And it's always with the intent that they're going to do something around policy. So food policy, our census is, the Food Policy Council census has changed over time. We started surveying councils in 2013, and the survey started with 12 questions. Always included in the survey is information about contact information for food policy councils. We asked that one person from each council fill out the survey every year, and thus far we've been doing it on an almost annual basis with a few months in between there. But since 2013, our knowledge of food policy councils, the kind of network of councils that's across the US and Canada, the issues that they're tackling, all of that has grown and evolved and changed. And so with that, we've kind of grown and evolved and modified our survey as well. When we started out surveying them in 2013, we were asking kind of what are your top priorities? What's your contact information? Do you collaborate with other groups? Where do you find information? And what are your greatest achievements? And since then, we've added questions to understand more about the membership of councils, their relationship to government, their civic and political engagement, their budget, funding sources, as well as this past couple of years, we've added questions really to dig into a little bit more about what does it mean to work on policy? What policies are they working on at what levels? What does it mean to advocate? How do you engage community members? Not just do you engage community members? So to get a little bit more nuanced information, and it helps us to understand kind of where councils are focusing, how they're leading their work, what questions are coming up for them as challenges. A lot of the questions that we've added to the survey have come from understanding the challenges that councils are facing. We added questions about funding because we know that's one of the biggest barriers for councils, and so we want to know kind of, well, where are they going to get funding? Kind of what are the sources? Are there other avenues that we see that aren't being addressed, aren't being tackled, and are there ways that we can help to kind of build bridges or connections to other funding sources? So listed here are kind of the objectives that we're looking at for the survey. We did a vast reorganization of the survey in 2018, and we distributed it in 2018 and then 2019. And we modified it slightly last year, but for the most part, we're hoping that the survey just maintains the same for a number of years, because we're hoping to look kind of long-term at what the data is telling us about trends in councils. But at this initial round, and we'll show you in the data, we're starting to pick up some interesting tidbits about councils, about their age and their funding and their policy work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel to talk about the data.
Thanks, Karen. So one thing I want to preface all of this with is that the data we're going to be talking about today is actually from the survey that we did in 2018. Because honestly, it takes a long time to analyze all of this data. As our survey has grown and evolved over time, the number of questions has grown and evolved. And suddenly, what used to take only a month maybe to analyze takes us several months on top of everything else we're doing. And it's quite a challenge. And then by the time we finally analyzed it, the next survey was coming out that it's a whole other process of trying to contact everyone, keep everything up to date. And so we are in the process of finalizing the numbers from this year's survey, 2019, and I'll share those, but the slides are not completely updated with those new numbers. When we share out the slides after the end of the webinar, we'll make sure to include the updated stats in those, so you'll see those early next week. But for an overview of what the Food Policy Council scene looks like since 2000, here is our best estimate as of 2018 of the number of active Food Policy Councils since 2000. And what you'll notice if you look at our slides from report to report or across different years is that these numbers fluctuate, and I'll explain why. But the number right now for 2018, so that was active at the end of 2018, is looking to be about 360 councils total across North America. And as you can see, the overall trend is that the number of active food policy councils is increasing. These lines do exclude the councils that become inactive. So that's part of the reason that the numbers fluctuate. And another part is that we learn about new councils that are added to our survey, but maybe have been in existence for several years before we find out about them. And as you can see, one reason that we started tracking separately the year of formation is because it's hard to keep track necessarily of when if the influx is happening because new councils are being formed or if it's because we are finding out about them. So this shows a good example of how basically since 2010, there's been a pretty steady number of councils being formed each year. And we expect that the numbers from the last 2 years will increase on this slide as we have found out about a lot of councils that started in 2017. Most of the councils report themselves to be active, but we also have 2 other categories that councils can note. They can either be in development, which we tend to think of as within the last 12 months of forming. And this is a challenge to define exactly whether a council is active or still in development, because sometimes councils can be in development for several years. And some councils don't want to even fill out the survey, even if they know that they're in development, because they say, well, we haven't formed yet. And we're like, but we still want to track you because we're still trying to get an idea of what's going on around the country. And it's still helpful if people are trying to find out how they can engage in local food policy in their area. It's still helpful to know that there's a group in development. So we still try to track them as best we can, but we recognize that we often miss a lot of the councils in development. And then the in transition category is another very tricky category. So there's a lot of councils, like the membership and structure of councils fluctuates a lot. And part of it's because of funding priorities change. Some of it is because of government support might change. leadership fluctuates and new people come in. And so as a result, councils often go through periods of transition. And even some of the most active councils might go through a year or two of being on hiatus or trying to restructure and refigure out what they're doing. And so some councils also don't want to fill out the survey during those periods because they don't know what the status of their council is, but we still are trying to track that information, so at least we can keep an idea in our head of whether or not they're still in existence in some form or not. So this in transition category is supposed to define that. But like I said, it also fluctuates dramatically, and so each year there's a number of councils that are probably in transition that we don't even know about, so we're not marking them as in transition. But we do the best we can. I think I pretty much went through all of this, so explained it as we went. Here's an overview of the number of food policy councils by each state in the US. As you can see, the number of councils is highest in California, but North Carolina and Michigan are also have a very significant number of food policy councils. And this is in part because a lot of these states at the top of the list in terms of number of food policy councils, they have conveners. So they have networks like Community Food Strategies in North Carolina or the Michigan Local Food Council Network that work to help develop and support local councils on the ground. And so a lot of the states that we see having a lot of food policy councils, Ohio, Kansas, Minnesota, Colorado, all of those states, and California, of course, all of them have state convening councils or networks. So that's a large reason that we see a large rise in food policy councils in those states. And if you read our report from earlier this year, you can learn a little bit more about some of those regional or state conveners. And here's a look at the number of food policy councils by Canadian province. Because this survey is a remnant of the Community Food Security Coalition's original directory of food policy councils, and because the CFSC organized across North America, we started and continue to survey councils in Canada. But we are not as up to date on our Canadian knowledge, in part because of the distance and in part because we don't have as many network connections in Canada. So we try to do the best we can in terms of tracking Canadian councils, but there's probably many that we're not even aware of. And so if you know of any Canadians, you can always encourage them to fill out the survey. And we're continuing to try to increase our connections with food policy councils in Canada. But because no one else was surveying them, we decided to continue doing it, and that's why you see it in our report. No worries. So this is a look at the age of food policy councils. And so this kind of shifts every year, in part because if the councils continue to stay on, we would like to see more and more of them existing for longer periods of time. But in general, about the largest segment of groups is now about 6 to 10 years old. And we have some that are over 10 years, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But as we see councils getting older, their priorities shift and their budgets change. And so there's some promising stats to look at in terms of seeing what's happening as councils get older. But we also continue to have an influx of new councils each year. The vast majority of councils in North America are now at the county level, and some are also at the city or municipality level. So overall, the vast majority of them are working at some way, shape, or form at the local level, because there's also some councils that work across both city and county lines. There are some that work at a regional level, and we define region as either multi-county or multi-state. We recognize that that can be a conceptually challenging idea because they're two different levels of region, but that's how we started defining it years ago, and we haven't really shifted over time.
And most of them are multi-county. The vast majority of them are working across counties versus working across states.
Yeah. And some of the ones that are working across states, they might be working across counties across states.
Yeah.
So they might not be working across the whole state, but their counties are bordering each other. And there's about 8% of the groups are state councils, and we also, on the side, work to help bring those state council leads together to talk about issues that are happening at state council level. And then there's also 1% of councils are located within First Nations or Native American communities. This number is also really hard to track because there's probably a lot of other action happening that's not in the concept of a food policy council per se, but they're doing a lot of the similar work that food policy councils do. So we learn more and more about how other Native American communities, for instance, are doing food system policy work and convening themselves, but they might be doing as part of other projects and therefore, or just not doing it in the context of a food policy council. So we wanted to recognize that. In terms of organizational structure, this is also a hard category to define because as the survey has evolved, we've tried to change and evolve our definition of what an organizational structure looks like along with the councils. So I think in the first few years, we didn't even have housed in another nonprofit. I think it might have been merged with the nonprofit category. The embedded in university extension has emerged as a category, but I don't think that was originally one of them. And grassroots coalition is something that is kind of confusing to a lot of people, but basically that's a group that doesn't have an organizational home per se, but they're just a coalition of people that come together out of their own volition. And we've noticed over the years, we don't have this data perfectly trackable because the number of categories that we've had has changed over time, but we have noticed over years that councils have shifted from being more likely to be grassroots coalitions, and now they're institutionalizing themselves more and are more likely to be housed in another nonprofit, which is where groups that have fiscal sponsors, for instance, that's where they fall, or embedded in government, or becoming their own nonprofit themselves. So we are seeing a general trend towards being more institutionalized.
There are a few councils in the other category that don't fall neatly within these distinguished groups because they may be working as part of a university, a nonprofit, and some other like health coalition that have come together. And so their organizational structure is made up of 3 institutions that have come together, and so they don't fit nicely into one of these categories because none of them is emerging as their backbone or support organization because they all provide support equally.
Budget, something that's always really exciting to talk about. So a trend that we've noticed that hasn't changed a ton, but it's moving in a positive direction in some ways, is that a lot of food policy councils are operating on really small budgets. So as you can see, about a third of them have no budget whatsoever, and another third or so have a budget that's between $1,000 and $10,000. And so the amount of work that food policy council is doing is tremendous given how little resources that they have. There are some councils that have become really well resourced because they've been able to apply for grants, they've been able to get budget items and line items in the budget of their local governments to pay for a staff person. But as we see, it's a very consistent trend across the years that funding is one of the biggest issues that food policy councils face. And it's something that we are continuing to try to work on to help encourage funders to support food policy councils and also to help food policy councils best position themselves to funders in order to be able to increase their budgets and hopefully with it increase their ability to work on food systems issues. And Karen released the report that we've been working on for a year that is stories of different food policy councils and how they've gotten funding and also some of the struggles they've had along the way. So if you're on our listserv, you would have received that today, but we can also share that with you afterwards if you're not. This is one of the new questions we started asking in the 2018 survey is, where are you getting your funding? So up to this point, we only knew anecdotally where groups were getting their funding. We've started to try to track what types of funding groups are using. And interestingly, more and more councils are moving away from just relying on grants from foundations to other types of creative funding sources. For instance, groups are looking into earned income through different goods and services. Some are trying out membership dues. Some are trying crowdfunding. But we've also got the traditional private foundation and in-kind donations are still the major sources of funding for food policy councils. And we consider in-kind donations to be anything from space and location for them to meet to resources to host events.
And these top 5 categories, in-kind, private foundations, individuals, and government grants are the same, hold true both in the US and Canada. They switch a little bit, but for the most part, these are the 5 main funding sources for councils across both the US and Canada. We've also been trying to track over time
how connected food policy councils are to their government. Some councils intentionally embed themselves within government, but others intentionally avoid embedding themselves within government so that they are able to advocate more. In general, though, we do see trends across different types of organizational structures that groups are having government employees participate in the Food Policy Council, even if the council is not embedded in government. The government can support the Food Policy Council in some way, shape, or form, whether it's through a resolution or announcing that they support it, or through providing in-kind resources. In some councils, members are actually appointed by government, and that tends to be in the councils that are embedded within the government, but not always. And in some cases, government can seek advice from the Food Policy Council or even create the Food Policy Council through legislation.
We started to ask this question a little bit about, one of the questions I think we get asked typically is kind of what makes the council work? Like, what's the secret sauce, or what's the secret ingredient to the sauce that makes it work so well? And we don't have an answer for that, because all councils are very different. And for some, being embedded in government works really well because they have the administrative support from their mayor, from their city council members, from their county commissioners, that they value food and they want food to be a part of the work that they do. And so they put effort and energy behind it. For some councils, that's not the case. And so understanding kind of what are the nuances in the relationship, because in being embedded in government is only one way of working with government. To change policy, you have to in some way have some relationship with government. And so we're trying to understand kind of, is there a balance in that relationship and what makes it work within the context of the communities that are able to change policy.
Another category we started looking into over the past few years is what types of people or members are on food policy councils, and do they tend to come from certain segments of the council or not, and how does that membership representation influence the priorities or policies that food policy councils are working on. And as you can see here, a lot of the food policy councils are really truly representing multiple different sectors. Most of them have community members, representatives from public health organizations or agencies. A lot have representatives from anti-hunger or emergency food operations, food producers, colleges and universities, government staff. And then we kind of see a less but still significant number of people from healthcare organizations, labor, food retailers, social justice, which is a broader group, but that includes things like local grassroots organizations that are organizing around racial justice, for instance, in an area. Economic development can be both from government organization or from developers, elementary or school teachers or representatives, faith-based organizations, processing and distributors, natural resources and environment. So this is a broad category that includes people who are working in the field of sustainability, for instance, or climate change related issues, food waste, elected officials, and philanthropy and youth. We're seeing a rise in the number of councils that are starting to have their own separate youth food policy councils, or at least there's some councils that are breaking out and having work groups of youth that are trying to engage more with the younger generation. And as Karen mentioned before, we used to just ask the groups about what are your priorities. That was the original iterations of the survey, literally just asked, what are your top 3 priorities? And as the survey has evolved over the years, we've started breaking this out into organizational priorities, or the internal dynamics of the group, and policy priorities, which, as we defined before, policy is very broad, but that tends to be the topics that food policy councils are addressing. Because we recognize that while groups might want to work on the whole food system, some might tend to gravitate towards certain issues. We want to understand where they're focusing the most of their attention. And so in terms of organizational priorities, community engagement is one of the most common, or the most common organizational priority amongst food policy councils. Advocacy and policy capacity building is another one. We actually have a toolkit that can help increase your advocacy capacity if you wanted to learn more about that. Strategic planning or policy planning, education, networking, these are all some of the top organizational priorities. As you'll notice on the far right, monitoring and evaluation is one of the least common organizational priorities, and I think that's an issue that a lot of food policy councils continue to say that they struggle with, or that they want to work more on but don't have the time or resources to devote to it. So we've definitely been thinking about how we can help support food policy councils in monitoring and evaluating what they're doing, but we recognize that that's challenging without lots of funding or staff support.
I think this slide is a really great kind of reiteration of the role that food policy councils play in terms of their convening power. They work on policy change, they do some programming work, but they really are this entity that provides education and networking of groups that are working in some way on the food system and helping to elevate the value of why it matters to focus on the food system. And so these organizational priorities really showcase kind of the education, the networking capacity, the community engagement focus of councils and being that convener and that collaborator that brings groups together.
And here's some of those community engagement activities that Karen was highlighting. So this is a new question that we started in 2018 because we wanted to understand more about what specifically groups were doing when they said they worked on community engagement. So we have everything that we could think of in terms of community engagement. I think we added a few categories in this year's survey to encompass some of the other categories that people brought to our attention in 2018. But the most common community engagement activities were supporting partner organizations in their work, co-hosting educational events for the community or holding community forums. Some of those community forums involved like holding forums with potential politicians to highlight what they're working on. Some of them are surveying their community and evaluating data from that, or hosting events, distributing newsletters, etc. And you'll see that very few did not organize any community engagement activities, about 10%. So this is really highlights the importance of food policy councils for their communities. And here we get to the favorite, the policy priorities question. So this is again, it's encompassing of all types of policies. So I think some groups struggle with this one because they're like, well, we don't work on policy, but when we consider policy and we include things like farm to school or other institutional procurement changes, you are working on policy. But we recognize that a lot of groups would maybe call these themes or types of areas of the food system that they're working on. Healthy food access is definitely the most common and has been the most common for the entire time we've been doing the survey. And we include in healthy food access a variety of different issues from looking at food deserts or whatever term that you use in your community, improving access to farmers markets, SNAP benefits. I'm trying to think of like what else on the top of my head, but this is a very inclusive, broad category. So a lot of people have actually asked us if we could break it out and make it more defined. But beyond healthy food access, economic development, anti-hunger, food production, food procurement are all, land use planning are all common priorities too. As you'll see on the far right, the least common are natural resources and environment, where we include topics like climate change related or water related issues and food labor. It's not that councils aren't necessarily working on those issues, but when we ask this question, we ask councils to define their top 3 policy priorities. So they might be working on those other issues, but they might not be the key focuses of what the work they're doing. So that might be why they don't select it here.
And we've seen over the years categories like food waste reduction and food labor growing up within the interest of councils as being a priority. So this is for 1 year, what their top 3 priorities are, and they change. Like Rachel said, healthy food access has been the #1 across time, but we do see kind of changes in some of the other categories as interest amongst councils grows.
And one other challenge with this question is we've tried to compare them over the years to see, are there shifts in terms of policy priorities? But as our knowledge and as the evolution of food policy councils has changed, we've added more categories to this policy priorities question. In fact, I think the first 2 years, we thematically organized them ourselves, and they were just fill in the blank questions. So we didn't even have categories. But now as we have discrete categories and we've had to add or edit and modify them in some way, shape, or form, it's made it really difficult to try to compare, has there been an increase in people working on anti-hunger versus food waste reduction, because those categories didn't exist in every year of the survey. So that's part of the reason that we hope the 2018 version of the survey will stay constant in future years so that we're able to do more longitudinal analyses. And we also started tracking advocacy activities because we recognize that sometimes groups might be working on policy but don't actually have a discrete policy win because that can take several years. So we've started tracking what exactly councils are doing in terms of advocacy, and whether they're meeting with policymakers or providing recommendations, supporting or directing an advocacy campaign. calling policymakers. And what we found is that most councils are engaging in advocacy. Only about 15 to 20% aren't. And so this is actually interesting because a lot of councils have brought to our attention that they're concerned about working on advocacy, depending on how they're structured. If they're within government, for instance, or housed at a university, they might have a challenge in working on advocacy. But actually, at least in terms of how we define advocacy activities, most councils are doing some form of advocacy.
All right, so now we're going to go a little bit deeper into the information. We started to kind of look across age, geography of the councils and see if there was any variation in any trends that we were noticing. So in general, these are kind of things that we were finding, that younger food policy councils, meaning that they're under the age of 5 years old, they focus on membership recruitment, strategic planning, research and data collection, developing their governance structure. None of these are kind of aha things that they would do. They kind of make sense in terms of you're bringing a group together, you're starting to figure out what your role is as a group, coming together, understanding your landscape before you dive into some of the advocacy work. One interesting thing to note is that they're more likely to prioritize economic development as a policy priority. A lot of them are focused at a county level, and no surprise, they have smaller or no budget because they're just getting started. But as they age, what we see is that older food policy councils, being 6 or older, tend to focus more on their building the capacity of their council members to engage in advocacy and policy work. They do focus a lot more on networking, fundraising, as well as diversity and inclusion. This becomes more of a priority as councils age, because now that they kind of have some experience grounding, they're starting to think about kind of how they broaden their council a little bit more, and to dig a little bit deeper into some of the issues in food systems. We see them hosting more trainings of community members to help them build their advocacy and policy capacity. They also tend to host more community forums. Older councils kind of include more complex issues in their policy priorities, land use, labor issues. We see them engaging in more advocacy activities, and they tend to have larger budgets. So this slide is a comparison. It's showing the approximate annual budget of councils by age. And the purple and green are councils that are above 6 years old, and the blue and yellow are councils that are 5 years or less. And as you can see, kind of as they get older, the trend in each column seems to go up for those that are older. Not all of them, but in general, you see that those that are 6 or older tend to have budgets that are over $100,000. In addition, this slide is a busy slide, but it also is showing how advocacy activities change by the age of the Food Policy Council. And in general, councils that are older tend to do more advocacy activities across the board in all of these categories. And the ones that are younger tend to be the ones that we don't see any advocacy activities happening we asked this question in the last 12 months. And a lot of that is due to just their forming and getting set up and starting. So again, some more trends. We looked at age. We also looked at the organizational structure of councils. What we're trying to figure out is, do these factors make a difference? And we can't say definitively, but we can kind of show some trends in the data that we're seeing. So councils that are embedded in government have a stronger connection to government because they're embedded in government. They're also more likely to prioritize strategic planning and research and data and collection. And some of that makes sense. Councils that are embedded in government have more access to data and research that's being collected by the government, by different government agencies. And a big part of kind of working with planning departments in your local government is strategic planning. It is developing a plan for action. Nonprofit food policy councils, or those that are housed in nonprofits, are more likely to have higher budgets. They're also more likely to host educational events. And we see that they prioritize local food processing over other organizational types. It's not really clear why, but this is one of the interesting facts that we've noted. Food policy councils that are embedded in a university, unfortunately, these tend to have smaller budgets. They focus more on education, which makes sense for where they're housed, and they're also least likely to focus on advocacy. And some of that makes sense because of restrictions and kind of limitations on the work that they can do in engaging in policy and kind of being nonpartisan. Grassroots coalition FPCs also tend to have smaller budgets. They're more likely to prioritize membership recruitment and retention, and they're more likely to focus on advocacy and policy capacity building. Grassroots coalitions have a lot more latitude in terms of working on policy and advocacy because they often don't have restrictions based on their being embedded in government or associated with the university. We saw kind of this slide points to the fact that organizations that are housed in a nonprofit or a nonprofit themselves tend to have higher budgets. The purple and orange bars are food policy councils that are housed in a nonprofit organization or their own certified nonprofit organization. And as you can see, kind of looking at those that have budgets of over $100,000, it points to the being a part of nonprofit, having that structure, that ability to apply for grants because you have that designation provides them with a lot more leverage to be able to fundraise.
So now we're going to talk about some trends in policy work. So in the earliest versions of the survey, we didn't collect information on what specific types of policies councils were working on. We only asked the question about their priorities. But as we realized over the years, we wanted more examples of what exactly groups are working on, because a lot of times we'll get asked by a council, do you know any groups that are working on policies related to X topic? And we couldn't easily say that because we only had a random assortment of anecdotes in our arsenal. And so instead we started asking specifically, in addition to the policy priorities question, what types of policies have you actually worked on? Because groups might work on more than just their top 3 policy priorities. And the results are illuminating. And we're only going to show you a brief highlight of which areas are not being worked on, because the details are more than we could present in this webinar. But what I will say is that we have been collecting this for both legislative policies as well as institutional policies and regulatory policies. So we know what groups are doing in all of these different categories across those different types of policies. And so there's a lot of data there, and we're actually going to share the full slideshow with you all after the end of the webinar. So if you want to dig into the details and learn specifically which councils or how many councils are working on legislative policies related to food waste reduction, you can learn that. And we're not going to share the specific names, but if you ask us what councils are, we're happy to connect you to.
Yeah, we're still trying to figure out kind of what exactly we can do with this information and what it tells us. There's a lot more that we're seeing that councils are doing, and we haven't necessarily had the space to be able to look beyond just the policy priorities to these different areas of advocacy work or policy work that they're doing to really understand kind of, what are the main buckets of institutional, legislative, administrative priority in these topic areas that they're working on? Are there other things, that we're seeing where they may not be working a lot in? So there's a lot more that we're still trying to understand with some of this data.
And this is part of the reason it takes us so long to analyze everything, is because running the crosstabs on these questions, it takes a long time. And there's a lot to sort through. But in general, you can see that healthy food access, economic development, anti-hunger, those topics that were the most popular policy priorities are also the ones that most people are working on policy change. But there are still a significant number of councils that are working on food, labor, and natural resources and environment and transportation policies. And that was not reflected in our policy priorities because they weren't necessarily the top priority. So that's something that was interesting to us. We've also been asking about what factors are influencing what types of policies councils are prioritizing. Relationships with other organizations was the top factor by far, and followed by FPC's membership and their leadership. So we have explored in a paper that is going to be coming out soon, like the extent to which, for instance, the composition of an FPC's membership is actually influencing their policy priorities. So if they have representatives that are food producers on their council, are they more likely to prioritize policies that are related to food production? And we do find a relationship in some of those areas, and we'll send out that paper when it comes out in a few months. But that is an interesting deep dive that we've looked into one of these factors.
The other piece that's interesting about this slide and the list that we provided councils to rank how much these factors influence their policy work, the things that fell to the bottom of this list, not saying that they're insignificant, but we're funding support for policy, funding of the Food Policy Council, the priority of the funders. And part of this could be related to the fact that over 60% have a budget that's under $100,000. And so funding doesn't really matter because there isn't funding available. But it also kind of indicates that there's these other elements of their relationship with other organizations in the community. There's these other factors, these human factors of the context, the network that they're involved in that have an influence on what policies that they work on versus it being driven by the funders.
Speaking of relationships, this slide is where we also ask about how important are different relationships to your policy work. And as you can see, nonprofit leaders, local elected officials, community members all play an important role in helping define and advance a council's policy work. Federal legislators and federal government employees are probably the least likely, and that makes sense because councils are least likely to be engaging in federal issues. But we are starting to see groups do that, and we do have a guide that's coming out in the next few months, hopefully, with examples of what councils have been working on related to the Farm Bill in the last iteration of it.
Yeah, we've seen a lot more interest at a federal level, and so we assume that these numbers will fluctuate over time as councils start to engage at higher levels of work outside of county. There's a growing network of state councils that, and we continue to see states come up with new councils as well, and so we might see these numbers change over time.
And our last deep dive into a plot this is a question that we ask as part of the larger systems question, which aren't even reflected in the rest of these slides. We have a big systems question that we're trying to get at how many councils are working on food systems and using a systems lens to do that. But this specific question, I think, comes up a lot in the Food Policy Council world about to what degree does the membership of the council reflect the racial, economic, and gender diversity of the community? And the answers vary, but a significant proportion say a lot or somewhat. So this is definitely an area that groups are working towards. And we do tend to see that groups that are older tend to prioritize this more and are working more to try to represent the diversity of their community. But it's a continual challenge for many food policy councils. And lastly, we asked two questions: what are your greatest achievements and what are your greatest challenges? And this is a fill in the blank, tell us what you want to tell us question. And then we thematically organize them. And so of the results that we get or got in the last iteration, advocacy to a policymaker was the most common greatest achievement, followed by implementing programs to address food insecurity, strategic planning, securing funding, or partnering to host an event. And some of the challenges, and the biggest challenge, as we've mentioned before, and you'll probably hear it over and over again, is funding. Also, recruitment engagement and membership and leadership retention are two common challenges. And this is something that is also reflected in our data when we see councils going through periods of transition and or dissolving, and that's a common reason why. Some councils are also talking about how they lack strategic plans or that they're having challenges trying to coordinate time to meet or to build consensus. And so now we just want to go over a little bit about how we're using this data and how we share it with others. So we have our online directory, which is a searchable tool. You can search by state to see what food policy councils are in your area. We also have an interactive map where you can zoom into an area in North America and click on and learn about food policy councils in that area. Those two resources are in the process of being updated with the current data. So we'll send out an email when they're completely up to date with all the 2019 data. But we tend to do that at the end of filling out all the survey just because it is labor intensive. And then we create summary reports each time. We're probably not going to do one for this year. We've decided to slow down the number of times we're doing the survey just because it takes so long. But the most recent report, which was released in March of this year, we'll share that with you all at the end of this webinar. And it's about 35, 40 pages long. So it's a very dense report, but we try to do the best we can to summarize the important stuff in the executive summary and also in the slideshow for you. This also informs our annual work plan. So the issues that councils are bringing up as some of their greatest challenges help drive what we decide to do as the Food Policy Networks team. It also helps us in creating presentations when we go to conferences and when we do technical assistance with individual councils. And so the results here are used a lot. So we just want you to be aware that even though we have to bug most of the councils to fill out the survey each year, it's very important data and it's being used almost every day. And we also share the data with other researchers who are asking for it to try to reduce the number of surveys that councils are asked to fill out.
We try to remove the contact information for the councils from the data that gets shared with other researchers so that we're not we're not oversharing or extending the information that you provide us. We also ask if it's okay for contact information to be posted in the online directory. If you don't wish for it to be shared, we won't include it. The survey is a really helpful, useful tool, and the reason why we did it every year was for that contact information, to understand kind of who's working in this field, who's leading these councils, so that we can start to help to connect councils if they have questions for one another. We've now started to get a process down to where hopefully it's not as cumbersome to collect that information. But this is a growing network, and we're just trying to keep track of how the network grows, because we see that there's a lot of interest. There continues to be a lot of interest. And part of what we're trying to do is facilitate relationships amongst councils. We can provide you with a report that summarizes all of these trends, but the best resource for learning from about what's happening on the ground is to connect with a peer council and learn from them. And so this helps to make those connections.
And one other thing I will mention is that we have started helping summarize and share this data with state leads. So those state convening groups that we mentioned before, in a variety, I think 18 states now have some form of a convening group. We've been trying to share that state specific information so that those state leads don't have to go and collect it themselves too. We also use this survey results to create a variety of resources, including the funding guide that we sent out to you today. But as you can see here are some of the resources we've developed over the years, and we often pick stories. If we can't, we often will ask the listserv if somebody wants to share their story about a certain topic, but we'll also look at the census results and see what groups say that they're working on this issue, and then we'll reach out through that contact and go from there. So it's a way for us to kind of reduce the number of times that we email you asking you for stuff.
And lastly, the data gets, some of the information on the greatest achievements gets pulled, and Anne has been the one responsible for developing the Wheel of Achievements. It's just a way to showcase in a very colorful, bright way the great work that's happening with councils in different areas around the food supply chain. So this is also on our website, and it is those greatest achievements that get shared in the survey that get pulled and used for the Wheel of Achievements. And we've done this for 2 years now.
All right, I think that's everything.
So with that, we'll stop talking. Please, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A or the chat box. We're going to look at it right now. We will provide a link to the census document when we send the follow-up to the webinar. So we will post that in the email back to everyone.
So Sue made a comment that many of the categories overlap. And so that is actually an interesting comment, because we've realized that over time. They were originally created out of the topics that groups were suggesting. So for instance, food waste overlaps with natural resources and environment, but we've tried to separate them out so we can get a better idea of, like, are there groups specifically working on water, soil, or climate change issues versus food waste, since food waste is such a common topic, and food waste also addresses hunger-related issues. But yes, we recognize that these categories overlap, and then that's part of a challenge.
There's a question about, we are connected to government through all of the ways designated on the survey. However, we haven't fully developed the mechanisms to change policy. I'm curious how other FPCs address policy through their connection to government. What is the process? Does it go through administration or elected officials? What councils have had success challenges, and what was their framework? We'd love to follow up with you after this to talk more about it, because each council goes through their government in a different way, and it depends on what they're trying to change. So sometimes if they're trying to change zoning codes around urban agriculture to allow for selling of produce at their farm, on their property, they may have to go through a zoning code change, which means that they might have to go through their planning department and then also go through a board or commission for approval, or even through their county or city council. Sometimes it may be changing some administrative kind of rules or fluctuations in how SNAP gets distributed. And so that might be working with their state agency or their local county office to talk about, are there ways that they can modify some of the rules that are around some of the distribution of SNAP. So it's not a great example, but anyways, a lot of this really depends on what it is they're trying to change. And the framework around how they change it also varies depending on what it is that they're trying to modify. So, Megan, we'll follow up with you after the webinar, because I think it would be helpful to get a little bit of context around what it is that you're working on so we can provide better examples for you.
We don't have any other questions right now, so if someone else has a question, feel free to ask it. We do have to log off at exactly 3 o'clock Eastern time because we have someone else who plans to use our Zoom account.
We have a comment from someone from Canada saying that they really appreciate the data collection here. We're really thrilled that you do. It's nice to know that someone in Canada is actually following along and listening and looking at the data too.
And yes, we do plan to post this webinar online. I'll send out an email with the webinar link on YouTube, as well as the slideshow with updated stats from this year. And yeah, we plan to share all of that in follow-up email.
Thank you. Always, if there's any, after we send out follow-up information, if there's other questions you have about councils, if there are other questions that you think would be good to know to be added to the survey, please let us know. For some of the states, we've added an addendum to the survey or a supplement that asks additional questions. So if you're working with a state and are curious about information about your council, feel free to contact us. We can add information just for council specifically in a state, and we're happy to share that information as well. Part of the reason we're doing this and sharing the information is that we're trying to reduce the number of times that councils get surveyed by outside entities. And so as much as we can use this opportunity to add questions, we're happy to do that.
Someone asked about any insights on diversity inclusion and how policy councils are addressing it over time. I'm wondering if older councils use different strategies than newer ones. We don't ask specifically about what strategies they're working on. We just ask, are you prioritizing this or trying to work on it? And we do see that it tends to be the older councils that are prioritizing it at all. And some of the younger councils just aren't even, they're still trying to get people together at a table before they can even start trying to figure out which people are there. But that is a good question. And I think it's something that we could start looking into in the future, the more in-depth look.
Yeah, and the point about volunteers is right on, that not everyone has the ability to volunteer their time. We've seen in some councils and instances, the diversity inclusion means that those council members, where it might be part of their job or profession to be a part of the council, they're taking their time and going to meetings of other groups or entities to show kind of their solidarity, their support for those other entities, aside from asking them to come and join them at the table. So using their time, their ability as a part of this council to be a part of other coalitions and groups, because they know that their work overlaps and they know that being a part of that group or showing up to their meetings helps to support the work of the council. So that's one way in terms of, for those that may be volunteering their time that's limited, that council members who might have the extra time can support those other groups.
Great, I think with that we might have to end it here, but if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email us and we're happy to respond and have a conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
And thank you for filling out the survey, all of you who do.
Take care.
Stop share first.